Train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he shall not depart from it. This proverb reminds us of the immense not only responsibility, but the incredible influence that parents have over the future of their children, and indeed, through their children, the future of a nation. But despite this, American Christians have largely begun to abandon this incredible responsibility and privilege to discipline and train their children for the future. And this has resulted in immense moral and spiritual decline in our nation. If we want to see revival and reform, then Christian parents must take this seriously and train up and, yes, discipline their children. I'm Pastor Eric, and this is Reviving the Culture. Welcome to Reviving the Culture, where we are expositing the book of 1 Samuel and discovering how God revives and reforms a nation. So far in our story, we have only gone for a short distance. We have looked at and been introduced to a lady named Hannah and her husband Elkanah, who at the beginning of our story were not able to have a child together. However, Hannah goes to God, the only one who can truly solve her earnest desire and need for a child, and asks God to give her a son. And when she does so, she dedicates her motherhood and her son to the glory and the service of God. And God honors her genuine faith and true dedication and gives to her a son who she names Samuel. And God is going to use this little boy in the future to begin the reform and revival of the entire nation. And then she comes and takes her son Samuel to Eli, the high priest at Shiloh, and dedicates him as a Nazirite to the service of God. Then, as we saw last time, she then lifts up her voice in praise to God, in which she acknowledges that God is sovereign. And we are reminded within this prayer that it is not by strength that we prevail, but by God's will and power. God values moral victories, not power and political influence. That is how God is going to revive and reform Israel. And now, Hannah and Elkanah are going to return home, and Samuel is staying behind in Shiloh to be trained up in the service of the Lord. And now our story takes a bit of a different turn, because now we are going to be shown two families side by side. We're going to see the further development of the family of Elkanah and Hannah and their son Samuel, and how they, despite their flaws and despite the many difficulties in their path, are going to strive to set a good example and to hold their son Samuel to the standards of the Lord. And this is going to be contrasted in our text, which we're going to be looking at today in 1 Samuel chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 11 through verse 26. And we're going to see Eli and his family are a completely different story. Whereas Elkanah and Hannah hold their children to a biblical standard, Eli is much more lenient. Despite being the high priest and the political leader of Israel, called a judge, he allows his sons to live in sin. And this is going to have not only terrible effects on the people around them, it's going to have truly tragic consequences on the entire family of Eli. And this comparison shows us the importance of disciplining, training our children. The family is the building block of society. If the family is rotten, if the family is neglected, then the church will suffer, the community will suffer, and the nation will suffer. The family is foundational. And we are reminded that it is the responsibility of parents, Christian parents especially, to train up their children in the admonition of the Lord. And I hope for you, whether you are a parent or a future parent or a grandparent or wherever you're at in life, that you will begin today to truly take this seriously and not see your job as someone who's just supposed to maybe provide a home and food and entertainment for your children. But you have a sacred trust. God has given to you eternal souls that will have an eternal destiny, and you have a hand in guiding and shaping these eternal souls towards their eternal destiny. You, if you desire to see the United States reformed and revived, must begin that not only in yourself, as we saw earlier with dedicating your personal life, but with dedicating your family and training your children to be followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. So we're going to begin here in our story. We're going to start off right at the beginning here in verse 11 through verse 14, in which we're going to see contrasted between the family of Eli and the family of Hannah and Elkanah, two different examples which are set. Let's read God's word. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now, it was the practice of the priest that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. Friends, as we see here two very different types of people, right? We're introduced and reminded through just this quick verse in verse 11 of the spiritual example that Hannah and Elkanah have set for their son Samuel. They're not perfect, but they do set a good baseline example. Elkanah, if you remember over and over in our story, is not perfect, but he is a spiritual leader of his family. He brings his family every year to Shiloh, as God wants him to worship the Lord. Even though the priesthood's a mess, he knows that he is responsible as an individual before God to be obedient to God's word, even if other people are being sinful. So he is setting that example and saying, we're going to the tabernacle to worship. To put that maybe in a little more common, like today's language, Elkanah is saying, we're going to church. We're showing up. We're going to be there because we have a responsibility before God to worship. And then, if you don't remember, leading all the way up to this point, Hannah has set an example of faith and sacrifice and dedication. Her entire motherhood and even her children, Samuel, have been given over to God. She is dedicating all of this to the Lord. That is an example, and that's something that Samuel, from the very beginning, when he's a toddler, he knows from what his mother has said to him, from how his mother teaches him and lives life with him. He knows that serving God is a priority. And he knows from watching his father and obeying his father's example that worshiping God is not optional or just kind of a thing you do on the side. He knows that this is important. So from the very beginning, we see that Samuel, as it says here in verse 11, that he ministers before the Lord. He's imitating the example that his parents have set for him. Do not underestimate, parents, the influence that your obedience, even if not perfect, because none of us are, don't underestimate the influence of your obedience on the values of your children. This is the example that Elkanah and Hannah have set for their son, an example of obedience and of prioritizing God. However, there is, of course, now this is contrasted with Eli, the high priest. If you were, to think about a high priest, someone who studied the law of God, someone who practices, goes through the sacrifices on behalf of the nation over and over, you would think that he would be someone who was very diligent in following God's law. But that's not what we see at all. Eli, in fact, is not obeying God's law. You may not have picked up on this right off the bat, but did you notice there at the beginning of our passage here in verses 13 through 14 that when the time of sacrifices came, that Eli would have his under priest, if you will, like his employees, would go and they would take a fork and they would dive into the pot and bring up meat for themselves. This is how they were paid. However, did you know that this is not how God's law has commanded for priests to be paid? This is contrary to the law of God. God has already told Israel in his law how the priests in the Old Testament were to be paid. In Leviticus chapter 7, it reads this: "The priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast belongs to Aaron and his sons." Aaron and his sons, they are the priestly family of Israel. "You are to give the right thigh of your fellowship offerings to the priest as a contribution. The son of Aaron, who offers the blood and the fat of the fellowship offering, shall have the right thigh as his share. From the fellowship offerings of the Israelites, I have taken the breast that is waved and the thigh that is presented, and have given them to Aaron the priest and his sons as their perpetual share from the Israelites." That's really different, isn't it? God's law has said that the priests are to be paid because if you remember from Old Testament times, the priests did not have any inheritance in the land. Their job was to act as priests, as intermediaries between the people and God, and as people who instructed the people of Israel in the law of God. They didn't have land with which really to support themselves. So the way that they were to be supported was for their work. The people of Israel would come and offer sacrifices to the Lord, and a portion of that sacrifice, part of the thigh and the breast, as we saw there in Leviticus, were to be given to the priests as their pay. However, that's not what Eli and his priests at Shiloh are doing. They are having the people of Israel instead boil the meat ahead of time, and then they come in with a fork and they just take as much as they want. This is Eli following the customs of his time period as opposed to the law of God. Now, we don't know exactly why this had become a custom or a tradition. Maybe it started off as laziness and just thought it was easier, or maybe they thought that through doing this, it would just be more convenient for the people, or maybe, this is more of what I suspect, that they could get more this way because it was just as much as they could get scooped out for themselves. If you notice, it was just whatever happened to come up, and oh dear, it just happens to be a little bit extra. Maybe so, maybe that's why, maybe it was corruption. But whatever the reason necessarily behind it, clearly Eli values tradition and custom over the law of God. And this has had an impact on his sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Hophni and Phinehas, his sons, who are following their dad in the priesthood at some point, they're just priests, they're not the high priest, obviously. They have noticed that their father doesn't actually have that much respect for the law of God, despite what maybe Eli says. Instead, he is following his own customs, his own tradition, whatever he prefers to do, whatever his excuses. And so, what has that resulted in? Well, we see right there in verse 12 that Hophni and Phinehas become scoundrels. It's a pretty harsh word. They have become scoundrels in what way? What is the root cause behind their bad behavior? They had no regard for the Lord. They had no respect for God or his laws. And why should they? Dad doesn't have respect for the laws of God either. Once again, I will reiterate this. Parents, don't underestimate the influence that your example has on the values of your children. Children listen way more to your example and your deeds than the words you say. Think of the example that you set. And we see here the consequences already with Samuel, Hophni, and Phinehas and how different their lives are starting because of the example set by their parents. But that's not all. Our story goes on here. We're going to look at the next part in verses 15 through verse 21. And here, we're not only going to see the difference between these two families of the examples that are set, but differences in the standards that are enforced. Let's read God's word. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the person said to him, "Well, let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home, and the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. What are the standards that are enforced by Eli? Well, not much of any standard at all. Do you notice what Hophni and Phinehas are now doing at the sacrifices? Their dad was completely just doing it his own way with the fork and maybe getting himself a little extra on the side. But his sons have gotten even worse. They are now coming and demanding that even before the offering is made to God, that they get an extra cut. The meat here that they're talking about is part of the Lord's portion of the sacrifice. That's why the people are saying, "Now hold on. Wait a minute, we got to give a sacrifice to God first, and then you can take whatever you want. We'll let you take double pay. Just let us sacrifice to God first." However, what do Hophni and Phinehas then do? They threaten them and say, "If you don't give us God's portion and we're going to take God's portion for ourselves, if you don't let us do that, then we're going to beat you up." These are some rotten scoundrels. These are bad people. And Eli, does Eli interfere? Does Eli step in and say, hold on. You can't do this. You can't, threaten people. You can't embezzle and steal what rightfully belongs to the Lord. No, he doesn't do that. He lets them get away with it. Maybe he wanted to be the cool parent. Maybe he just it's like, I don't want to make my sons upset, so I'm just going to overlook this. Or maybe he just thought his kids were perfect. Some American parents do that. Think their kids are perfect, never do anything wrong, or just don't want to feel uncomfortable about disciplining their kids. And look at the damage that this is doing. The people who we are going to see further the story aren't exactly in the best place spiritually. But even they are like, now hold on, this is too far. But it doesn't matter, because there's no standards enforced, and this is leading to further spiritual decay in the nation. They get worse and worse and worse. But this is contrasted very sharply with Hannah and Elkanah. Hannah and Elkanah don't have the best situation, do they? Hannah and Elkanah are not able to be with Samuel all the time. they've had to leave him at the tabernacle for training. But they do come and see him regularly. They make the most of the time with their son that they can. They regularly show up. They continue to not only set an example, but they have expectations of Samuel, don't they? We see that in that when they come, they expect for Samuel to be continuing in his training and service of the Lord. So much so that Hannah regularly makes him an ephod to wear. And this is a garment that really is only for people who are serving the Lord. She is expecting him to keep his commitments to the Lord. They are enforcing this to the best of their abilities. They are still setting a standard for their son, despite the physical distance that has come between them through this dedication. And even though maybe this wasn't the easiest, and believe me, parenting is never easy, but despite how difficult it must be, God blesses their efforts. The fact that they were trying, the fact that they were enforcing standards, that they were holding their son to certain expectations, God rewards that. Because what happens do we see? Yes, Eli blesses them as a priest, but it is God that actually is making the blessing happen. God steps in, and Hannah, who before, as we saw, was not able to have any children at all, now God has richly blessed her. Now she has 3 sons and 2 daughters in addition to Samuel. She has even more beautiful and wonderful children, and she has a home full of laughter and joy and happiness because she has been holding her son to this standard, and God blesses that. And you know what? God also blesses that in how Samuel develops. Have you noticed when you look here in your text at the end of verse 21, there's been a slight change of language. We see that we went from earlier Samuel ministering before the Lord to what is it described here? Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Because of the standards that were enforced, he was growing up and developing as a person in God's presence. Parents, grandparents too, anyone who's raising children, don't underestimate the massive difference that the standards that you enforce have on the spiritual development of your children. If you have godly standards and you enforce them, even if your family situation isn't perfect, and America is full of families that don't have perfect situations. We are full of hardships, heartbreaks, and difficulties. But that does not mean that your family cannot be wonderful and beautiful. That does not mean that you should give up and not try to raise your kids. No, friend, push back. Hold standards for your children. Expect them to rise up and to grow. Teach them, sit down with them, talk with them, explain to them what they need to do. Don't just be a brute authoritarian, and don't be absentee and just neglect them. Be involved and teach them to the best of your abilities. And if you do, God's blessing may very well surprise you in how they develop and grow in the admonition of the Lord. So this is where we've seen these two families contrasted so far. So far we've seen the example set and the standards upheld, what are being enforced. However, now we're going to see a difference in the family, but it's not so much in how they're parenting, but the difference in the results of their parenting. Let's conclude this part of our story here in verses 22 through 26. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. Talk about two very different results. Let's look at the results that Eli got. Eli has set a bad example, and he's not enforced any standards. And what have we seen now? Not only are they embezzling, stealing God's offering, but now they're even going to the point of being degenerate adulterers. These boys are already married. We know that later in the story. And they are going around sleeping with just all the different employees, servant girls that are around. And quite possibly because of the power difference between a servant girl and a priest, it may have been sexual harassment on top of that. These boys are disgusting. They are rotten, nasty people. And now people are getting so fed up with just how nasty and corrupt the priesthood is, they're coming to Eli and complaining. But Eli's just brushed under the rug, and now finally it says he's very old. Did you see that there in verse 22? These sons are not kids anymore. They're adults. And it's getting so bad that finally Eli's starting to get worried that maybe this is going to end in a bad way. So he finally, after all these years, the decades that have gone by, he now has a sit-down talk with his sons and says, now look, we're getting a bad reputation here. And maybe, who knows, maybe even something bad will happen to us. Maybe even God will do something to you. But you know what? It's too late. It's too late. Their hearts are hard. They're too old. They're not listening to Dad anymore. Dad's just the old guy who's going to retire soon. They have their own way of doing things. They don't care anymore. But worse still, not only are their hearts hard because of bad parenting, but that bad parenting has resulted in wicked behavior, which has brought on these boys the wrath of God. God has decided that he is fed up with these corrupt priests who are abusing and hurting other people, and he has sentenced them to death. That's the result of Eli's parenting. But what about Samuel? What's the result of Elkanah and Hannah's parenting, even though it wasn't perfect? We see Samuel is the complete opposite of Hophni and Phinehas. Whereas they have become more and more corrupt and wicked and nasty, Samuel has grown up to have not only a great blessing to others, because as we see, he grows in stature and in favor with people. The people around him are blessed by him. Even though he's still a child, they're like, that's a good kid. That is a good young man. And he blesses and encourages the people around him. But even more importantly, we see that he grows in favor with God. God is pleased with Samuel as Samuel has grown in the admonition of the Lord. That's the result of Hannah and Elkanah's parenting, which is radically different. And whereas we saw the sons of Eli are headed to doom, the son of Hannah and Elkanah, Samuel, is headed for glory. We're going to end our story here for the moment, but what can we take away from this incredible story that applies to us today? Well, the first thing I want to really challenge you today, if you're a father, if you're or a grandfather who is raising his grandchildren, be the spiritual leader of your home. Friend, Elkanah was a spiritual leader. Now, we've seen in the story Elkanah wasn't perfect. Elkanah's like you. He has sinned, he's messed up, he's done dumb things. But he did set the example for his son. He took his family to worship. He set that example and he was leading. Friend, you got to do the same. It is not the responsibility of the Sunday school teacher, of the children's church leader, or of the pastor to be the primary spiritual leader of your home. That is your job, not mine and nobody else's. Nobody else can do that job for you. You have to set the example for your children. Take them to worship. Maybe they whine and complain and say, oh, it's boring. Do you let your children not brush their teeth and not take a shower or take a bath because, oh, I don't want to? Of course not. Because you're the parent, they're a child, and you know what's best for them. It's no different with worship. Take them to worship. You teach them the Bible. Maybe you say, well, I don't know a lot. Well, first of all, teach yourself some more. You go to church and pay attention. But you know what? Teaching the Bible isn't about having all the answers. Do you think I know everything there is to know about the Bible? Certainly not. It's about just doing the best you can. And you know what? If you are trying the best you can, God's blessing will be on you. Be a spiritual leader. Be Elkanah, not Eli. Also, I want to encourage all parents, all people who are raising children, whether it's the moms or the dads, be an example. Don't be one of those parents that says, well, do as I say, not as I do. You know what? That's just stupid. Your kids are not going to follow that. Your actions speak so much louder than your words. If you are being rotten and sinful at home, but only putting a performance at church, your kids are going to see that. And it's going to have bad results in their life. Be an example to your children. Third, I also want to challenge you to do this. Discipline your children. You've got to enforce standards. Look at what happened to Hophni and Phinehas because Eli just let them get away with it. It didn't result in a happy situation. They got terrible. Friends, that's how it always turns out. It always turns out that way. If you do not enforce standards, if you don't discipline your children, you're not going to be the cool parent. You're going to end up badly. You love your children when you discipline them, when you hold them to a standard. Don't let them throw fits. Don't let them be bad. Don't let them be wicked. But teach them. Hold them to a standard, but then you know what? Explain to them why they need to do the right way. Take the time to really invest and teach them so that they not only are just doing it because, well, I don't want to get in trouble, but that they understand why it's good. Discipline, train them. And you know what? Even if your family situation is not perfect, neither was Elkanah and Hannah's. It wasn't like they had the easiest time enforcing standards for Samuel, but they did the best they could by the power of God, and God blessed them. Friend, submit your children to the Bible. And if you do that, you will be truly loving your children. And you may be incredibly surprised at the influence that can have in your church, in your community, and in the nation. We cannot revive and reform the United States if we do not get this right. Discipline, train your children in the admonition of the Lord. I want to thank you for joining me for this third part in our series through 1 Samuel. If you were blessed and encouraged by this, I'd like to encourage you to give this video a like and to share it with a friend. I want to give a special thanks to the artist for doing such an incredible job in putting together the art for this video. It absolutely makes everything so much better. And if you would like to find more about their artwork, I'll try to put a link in the description below. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.